Bert Kreischer. He is possibly the most polarizing figure in stand-up comedy today. He's also someone that I haven't talked about much, despite making videos about several other figures in the stand-up comedy world. For a long time, that was because my general impression of Bert was that he wasn't very interesting, despite his best efforts to make himself appear that way. I wasn't really interested in more Bert Kreischer, but it's been a while since I really watched any of Bert's comedy, and he had a new special out, so I thought, what the hell? Why not give it a shot? Unfortunately, Lucky was almost exactly what I would have expected from a Bert Kreischer special before going into this. Just to put things into perspective, the first thing Bert does in this special is theatrically take his shirt off and throw it up into the air onto the mic stand to roaring applause from the crowd. If you thought you were going to get anything different from this special, this moment lets you know that you aren't. So, rather than go through this special bit by bit, I thought I would do something similar to what I did with my Joe Rogan video, and go over what I feel are some of the major overarching problems with Lucky, and why it left me disappointed. Issue number 1. Lack of material and humor. I'm going to start off with an issue that is a bit broad, because I think it affects the entire special. That is, it feels like Bert is running out of material. Some of you might say that he's never had much material to begin with, and fair enough. That said, I feel like he was really spreading the material thin with this special. A couple of stories are straight up recycled from other podcasts or interviews that he's done, such as getting advice from Snoop Dogg when he found out his daughter was smoking weed.
I don't like it. Georgia got caught smoking weed.
This is at least a 5-year-old story because Bert says his eldest daughter was 15 at the time, and from what I can tell, she is now at least 20. And Bert's introduction to this story is that his daughters are growing up.
My kids are growing up.
So it's also kind of confusing and easy to lose track of when this is supposed to be happening and why. This entire bit was workshopped basically word for word when Bert was on the We Might Be Drunk podcast a year ago. Bert even included the aspect of this interaction with Snoop Dogg where he misunderstood Snoop saying he wanted to take a shot with Bert as wanting to take a shower with him.
I said, you invited me over here to take a shower with you.
I said, you said we was going to take a shower.
And he looks at me dead sober and he goes, I invited you here to take a shot with me.
He's like, bitch, I said we was going to take a shot.
It wasn't a particularly funny story on the podcast, and Bert didn't really punch it up during the special either. It's just a kind of amusing, you had to be there story that eats up about 5 minutes. Now, some people may counter that it's not a big deal to reuse material from podcasts, but I think it speaks to the point I raised at the beginning of this segment. I think Bert is running out of new material, so he is having to dip back into the well of things he has already said a number of times, much like he did with the machine story. I'm sure there are more examples of Bert repurposing stories from podcasts that I'm not familiar with because I don't fucking watch any of them. This is just one that I happened to see at some point and remembered. So, if any of these bits or stories have been told on podcasts before, please mention them in the comments. The bigger problem here is that even with the bits that Bert isn't double dipping on, as far as I'm aware, most of them are not interesting or funny. The middle of the special is mostly Bert trying to amp up relatively mundane, if not boring stories. For example, there is a stretch where he is talking about how he is lucky and finds things.
I'm the luckiest person you'll ever meet. I'm so lucky that if you lose something, I'll be the person that finds it.
One of those stories involves Bert finding a lost kid during a parade.
I found a child one time.
This is one of those stories that has a lot of filler, and Bert trying to amp things up by making it sound like a quest of some kind, when in reality the kid had just gotten away from a nearby party. The joke, and I am putting that in quotations, is that the kid can't remember his mom's name, but he's heard people call his dad by 2 names, David and Michael.
David? Baby Michael?
And even me just saying that should probably tip you off to the big reveal that the kid has 2 dads.
God damn it, Michael, have you been drinking? He goes, I had 1 drink, David. He goes, you were supposed to be watching Nathan.
This isn't comedy. And I'm not being woke or whatever and complaining about Bert making a joke about a gay couple. It's just that the story isn't funny. It really doesn't have any comedic payoff, so Bert just tacks on a couple of jokes about telling the story to Joey Diaz and his wife. Joey, the human Sharpay Diaz, just screams about the kid's parents being gay.
Loud as fuck, he goes, they're gay.
And Bert's wife says something about them being sugarfoots or whatever. So not only is it a you had to be there story, it's you had to be there squared. There is another story Bert tells during this mid-special goulash of boring bits that starts with him talking about how his daughter has impulse control problems.
Isla's got wild impulse control problems.
During the pandemic, Bert would get blackout drunk and his daughter would sit next to him and order things off Amazon. I want to quickly mention that this is a fairly similar premise to a much better joke told by Doug Stanhope on his 2013 special, Beer Hall Push. Bert goes on to describe the worst example of this drunk Amazon purchasing, which arose from trying to buy traffic cones so his daughters could learn to skateboard. Essentially, the only joke that arises from this bit is Bert imitating his wife, saying, "You can't buy them big boy traffic cones."
Them baby boy traffic cones. Them big boy traffic cones. Look at all them traffic cones.
To prove her wrong, Bert has his daughter buy 8 of the largest traffic cones, size 8, available on Amazon. The payoff to this bit is that his daughter actually bought 64 of them big boy traffic cones, which cost $2,400.
How many traffic cones did you get? $2,400 worth.
The only reason his wife and eldest daughter didn't tell him was because they wanted to see the look on his face. Bert ekes out one good punchline about duct tape and oven mitts, which is a callback to a mediocre joke from earlier, but that's about it. I could go on about this issue for the rest of the video because ultimately it's a problem that undermines most of the special. Nevertheless, there are other issues with this special, and as I discuss them, it will only reinforce my initial point that Bert is running out of material and Lucky lacks humor. Issue number 2, blue humor and vulgarity. I don't think it should be a surprise to anyone that blue humor and vulgarity are a part of Bert Kreischer's act. He's not quite as bad as Joe Rogan, who thinks that screaming dick or cum counts as a punchline.
How do you touch dicks and not be gay?
But he's not tremendously better either. I don't inherently have a problem with comedy that is vulgar or blue or gross or even shocking. One of my favorite comedians ever is Doug Stanhope, and you could use all of those words to describe his act accurately. He has told some of the most heinous boundary-pushing jokes of all time, but it takes a deft hand to pull it off, because the other end of the spectrum is something like Amy Schumer's jokes on The Leather Special, lowbrow jokes about poop, farts, and queefs that fail to push any boundary beyond that of common sense. Bert errs more on the Amy Schumer side of things. He has one joke that I think at least utilizes blue or gross-out humor in an effective way, though, so I will kind of give him his due. It comes as a result of Bert's daughters allegedly asking him to tell one feminist joke.
They said to me, they go, "Dad, for this special, can you write one feminist joke?"
Bert says that women across the board are better than men. His explanation is that women will occasionally tell a man that it's not a good idea to go down on them because they're not so fresh, whereas a man has never warned a woman not to go down on him. For that reason, Bert wholeheartedly believes that no man should ever legislate what a woman does with her body, because every man at some point in his life has thought he knew better about a woman's body than she did,
and we went down there anyway.
The sentiment is slightly undercut by Bert doing some physical comedy where he pretends to dry heave
Oh my God.
and also makes some timely references to Jackass.
My name is Johnny Knoxville, and this is a Stinky Pussy Challenge.
But all things considered, it's fairly well conceived, and for the most part, it does make good use of blue humor. You can't say the same for a lot of jokes from the special. Roughly the first 10 minutes is spent talking about how old and gross his wife is, but also how much he likes banging her.
53. I'll tell you, baby.
He talks about both in pretty excessive detail, like comparing his wife's vagina to an old broken-in baseball glove.
Smells good, your fingers fit in it just right.
Or going on about how sweaty and smelly her boobs are.
Her tits stink.
I know a lot of this is probably just Bert increasingly leaning more into comedy for middle-aged people about middle-aged shit, but if he wasn't pandering to a specific demographic, it would just be that Amy Schumer humor I was talking about earlier. Later on in the special, he is talking about dogs, and makes a number of jokes about his penis, like saying he got hard while cuddling with his female bull mastiff on edibles.
You cuddle with your dog and your dick gets hard?
Or talking about how his new dog is always obsessed with his dick.
And he loves my dick. I mean, this dog.
I think they're supposed to be a little edgy and graphic, but they're so poorly executed that they come across as the CTE-riddled attempts at humor of a man like Brendan Schaub.
If he sees my dick, he's like, oh, that's mine. I'm eating that today.
This is just a sampling of a few notable examples, because about half of Bert's punchlines are just some kind of joke about dicks or bodily functions. Bert's overuse of vulgarity and blue humor may not be the biggest problem with the special, but again, it speaks to a broader problem. The stories he is telling are usually not particularly interesting or funny, so he tries to pepper them up with frat boy-style humor. With that in mind, there is another way in which he enhances his material. Issue number 3. Embellishing, exaggerating, and bragging. If there was one aspect of this special that I would expect to raise the ire of comedy fans, it would be Bert's tendency to embellish, exaggerate, and brag. I hesitate to say lie because even though Bert is viewed as a liar in the bigger picture, we're only talking about the comedy special here. It's not quite like Brendan Schaub lying about established facts that were very often documented on video and contradicting a story he told on multiple podcasts for like a year. With Bert, it's more so this persistent cloud of doubt that hovers over everything he says. In some ways, it's hard to describe, because his self-obsession and need to brag are woven into every story at such a fundamental level that it's difficult to cite examples without it seeming like you're cherry-picking. But in a more general sense, if you listen to almost any one of Bert's jokes, you will probably be hit with at least one line where your gut reaction is just incredulity. Did that really happen, Bert? Did they really say that? Did you really do that? Yes, comedians bend the truth, but Bert does it so constantly that it breaks the pact between the performer and the audience that allows comedians to get away with bending the truth for the sake of a joke. One that stuck out to me in particular was during Bert's closing bit about putting his dog down. Sorry, spoilers. Long story short, the vet tells Bert and his wife that they'll need to put their dog down. So to deal with the situation, Bert starts making jokes, like sarcastically asking if the vet wants Bert to throw her in the pool or something. That isn't really the improbable part of the story to me. Where I got taken out of it was when Bert just had to let everyone know that the vet was crying laughing at his jokes.
He is crying laughing. Now he's crying laughing and he's like, hold on, stop, no.
I think it's an interesting window into Bert's thought process. In Bert's mind, nobody but one of the dark and twisted 250 would ever think of making a joke at such an inappropriate time. So much so that the vet was taken aback. Maybe even more importantly, though, is Bert felt the need to remind the audience that not only does he crush on stage, he also crushes in his personal life.
And he goes, fuck, that is good.
It doesn't add anything to the story. It's an irrelevant detail that only serves as a way for Bert to brag. As I said years ago with Brendan Schaub, the issue is not simply lying. It's okay to some degree if it makes the joke funnier. Most comedians fudge the truth a bit. The problems start when you're making shit up to enhance your mythos. When Bert embellishes, it mostly just serves to make him seem cooler or more badass. There are a few bits from the special where Bert does this, and it destroys suspension of disbelief completely. The absolute worst example of this comes at the beginning of Bert's bit where he talks about being lucky and finding things.
I stand up, I said, my name's Bert Kreischer. I find lost things.
He starts the story off by saying that 13 years ago, he took his girls to the beach. His family was sitting between a motocross couple and a black couple. Bert claims the black guy lost his wedding ring while shaking out a beach blanket, even though that makes no sense.
Wedding ring flies off his finger into the sand. He goes, oh shit, I just lost my wedding ring.
But have no fear, Bert is here. Because he knows his superpower, Bert claims he stood up and said, my name is Bert Kreischer, I find lost things. What follows is Bert claiming that everyone involved searched the beach until they all gave up, except for Bert. Even the guy who lost his wedding ring gave up.
Then he gives up. He says, we're not going to find it. I said, you are not going to find it.
But Bert persisted and kept sifting through the sand until, and I quote, the ring slid onto my finger as if the Lord himself placed it there and said, don't let them forget who you are and what you do. Bert then proceeds to berate the people and makes them Google who he is, to which they say that he is Bert Kreischer and he finds lost things.
Google the name Bert Kreischer, see what it says he does. Motocross guy goes, it says he finds lost things.
There are a few problems with this story. The biggest would be that Bert actually did find a wedding ring in a SeaWorld parking lot back in 2010, which would be roughly 13 to 14 years before this special was recorded. But it was a woman's ring, and he actually ended up returning it to the descendant of the previous owner in 2020. On that detail alone, we can rule out that Bert is just retelling that story. So, we are expected to believe that within the same time frame as he serendipitously found a wedding ring in a parking lot, Bert also found another person's wedding ring on a beach, and it literally slipped onto his finger.
His wedding ring slides onto my finger.
Something so ridiculous that even fairy tale writers from the Middle Ages would consider it a bit too much. And then there is the aspect of Bert constantly demanding throughout the story that people Google his name and then making them say that he's Bert Kreischer and he finds lost things.
I said, make him say it. He goes, your name's Bert Kreischer, you find lost things. I said, look up and tell the Lord.
Does any of this seem remotely plausible to you? If it were true, wouldn't the bit be, I found 2 fucking wedding rings within a year? Isn't that insane? Even if you want to just turn off your brain and not care, it's too much. And Bert constantly giving himself kudos throughout the whole bit makes it even worse.
My name's Bert Kreischer. I find lost things, don't ever forget that.
And I want to make it explicitly clear that he frames this as the small story and a mere sample of how he's lucky and finds things.
That's the small story!
But as bad as this one single moment is, it's also a systemic issue. Even when Bert tries to write self-deprecating jokes about himself, he's still the center of attention, and they're still implausible. Such as when he was describing how stupid he is by saying that he thought Anne Frank and Helen Keller were the same person.
I found that out at the Anne Frank house.
And he was making jokes about this.
We go into her kitchen and I go, here's where she burned her fingers. She was trying to read the waffle iron.
Whoa, Nelly, everybody back up and get the caution tape out. We got an edgy comedian making jokes about the Holocaust. This guy's mind goes to places where angels fear to tread. The worst part about this bit is that it could actually be good if Bert wasn't making it so hacky and if he wasn't trying so hard. I could see a better comedian like Anthony Jeselnik making this premise work relatively easily because he would just be telling the joke and not trying to make you believe this was a real event that actually happened. This is why so many of Bert's stories fail to land for me. Bert is trying as hard as he can to make you think that these were really things that happened to him, which is just lame. He has had plenty of interesting experiences that actually happened. Why does he feel the need to make stuff up and embellish existing stories? It comes across as extremely desperate and sad. But I digest. There is one more segment from the special that I think combines all of the problems we've discussed thus far, and they're distilled down into one story. The story about putting down his dog. Issue number 4, The Dog Story. Bert's closing segment is a story about putting his dog down.
We put our dog down.
As a personal aside, this was something I had to go through late last year under similar circumstances as Bert. I had to put down a dog that I had for nearly 10 years very suddenly, and it's still something that I feel like I am dealing with emotionally. But Bert's story didn't resonate with me for many of the reasons I discussed throughout this video. For one thing, it's a fairly unremarkable story. Bert even repeatedly mentions during the story that this is something we've all been through, and that's why he feels comfortable talking about it.
I know you've been there. I'm cool sharing this because I know we've all been there.
If you're going to do a bit about something that is a fairly universal experience, I think you have to do something really unique with it. What Bert does is tell a story about putting his dog down that is really about Bert Kreischer. It's overly long, with Bert going on a number of digressions and telling some of those weird jokes about his dick that I mentioned earlier. He lets you in on inside jokes and tries to contextualize the importance of this dog to his family. But again, it's all centered around him.
Girls go to bed, Leanne goes to bed, I stay up drinking whiskey with this dog, and I'm drunk talking to her, you know?
How he had this secret drunken late night conversation with a puppy where he laid out how good her life would be and all she had to do in return was protect his family.
I said, baby girl, you are about to have the best life. You have nothing to be nervous about. All I need is when I'm gone, I need you to be my terrorist.
When he's telling the story of hearing the diagnosis from the vet, it's actually about how much Bert made the vet laugh with his dark sense of humor.
Now he's crying, laughing, and he's like, hold on, stop, no.
When he's talking about the dog being put down, it's about how Bert didn't get to say goodbye, even though he's happy that his daughters did, and how he refused to cry because his dad told him never to cry in front of his daughters.
Anytime I cried as a young man, he'd say, hey, don't be a bitch.
I didn't say goodbye to my dog, which is fine because in my book, I'm like, at least I didn't cry.
Very little of this is actually funny, and I don't think it was intended to be. I think it was supposed to have greater emotional significance, but it came across as the maudlin ramblings of a perpetual drunk who is just good enough at acting to repeatedly pretend he's about to cry at crucial moments in the story.
I said, baby girl, I realized, hold on. Everything that was ever asked of me with the best goddamn dog. I'm not going to cut your ears off.
In the closing lines of the special, Bert tries to combine this emotional sincerity with some zany dark humor at the expense of the possibly imaginary dog euthanizers who have been left aghast by the outrageous jokes from Bert and his family. But to me, he mixes them like oil and water.
This guy is fucking The last thing I say is I look at this dog, I go, baby girl, you still make my dick hard.
The story contains all of the issues I've mentioned thus far. It's too little material, drawn out too thin, he's trying to be edgy and vulgar, but it's not well executed, and it's a probably exaggerated story, focusing mainly on Bert. But there is another problem. Issue number 4.5. Parallel thinking. I'm not going to say Bert Kreischer stole any jokes from Doug Stanhope on this special, because I can't in good faith say that I believe he did. It's probably sheer coincidence that they both told jokes about putting down pets in recent releases. In reality, the stories don't really even bear any similarities beyond the one. They say comparison is the thief of joy, but Doug's bit is better. I mean, that goes without saying, but it's better in a way that makes Bert's bit ring hollow. Because Doug is capable of blending sincerity with black humor and vulgarity. The bit about putting down his dog isn't even the best example of that. But there is something in the comparison between the two bits, and relevantly, Doug's story about assisting his mom's suicide that made me think. During that story, Doug talks about roasting his mom as she was essentially fading in and out of consciousness.
And then we just roasted her as she fell in and out.
It sort of stuck with me while watching this special because Bert makes a very similar comment about telling inside jokes and stories to his dog on Lucky.
I go, what do I, throw her in the pool? I go, do I put a pillow over her snout and wait till her tail stops wagging? And I start running through all the nicknames and all the inside jokes I have with my dog. I said,
the reason it stuck with me being that Doug made the comment on Discount Meat that you can't really roast a dog like you would a person because they're not in on the joke.
The difference is with your pet doesn't understand the jokes that you're making at his expense about him while he's being killed, like my mother did.
I think that difference in thought process illustrates the difference in depth and intuition between comics like Doug Stanhope and Bert Kreischer, as well as the purpose of the stories themselves. Doug's story uses dark humor to effectively communicate the emotional experience of realizing that when you have a pet that is terminally ill, you have to decide how long it has left to live. Whereas Bert's story uses emotional pleas to disguise a story that is ultimately about Bert and what a dark sense of humor he has, which is emblematic of all of the problems with this special as a whole. Bert has no ability to tell a story without making it about himself. Final thoughts. I went into Lucky wondering if Bert's comedy deserved the hate it gets, and I'm still not entirely sure. I did not like Lucky, but I don't think he's the worst comedian out there. He's nowhere near as bad as Brennan Schaub is, despite the comparisons people want to make. But this special wasn't good either. There were a couple of bits that I found somewhat entertaining, but they're not really noteworthy enough to bring up. They would be filler jokes on a good special, but they're kind of the high points here. It's hard to look at this special, or any of Bert's specials for that matter, and argue that he deserves this level of fame and success. I think that is why there is such a desire to disparage his comedy. Moreover, I think people also see Bert's comedy as a reflection of his personality and public persona, because they are intrinsically linked. Bert's self-obsession in his act is an aspect of his real-life personality. For that reason, Bert is a mirror into an aspect of ourselves that most people would rather not acknowledge. We've all been Bert at one point or another. Most people have that one story that they've repeated so many times that it eventually lost its magic, like Bert's machine story. We've all wanted to be the center of attention, or even just that guy who gets recognized because he has a gimmick, like taking his shirt off. Most of us have done something that now makes us cringe whenever we think about it. In one regard, I think it explains some of Bert's success. A lot of people feel like they have common ground with Bert, but for a lot of people, Bert is a reminder of how cringe they once were, or could continue to be if they allowed themselves. Bert is all of the undeserved arrogance, narcissism, self-obsession, and lack of self-awareness that you find in the average 20-something frat bro. But it's wrapped up in the body of a middle-aged comedian who looks like a 6-foot-tall Andre the Giant. And it's impossible to divorce that from his act. Again, the first thing he did when he got out on stage was dramatically take his shirt off, because it's just part of his persona. It's what the people want. In a similar vein, I don't think there is a single story from this special that doesn't involve Bert drinking.
She makes me a fresh one, then she gives me 2 baby bottles of Jack. Drinking I blacked out, passed out. I'm naked, drunk as shit, pass out. Like during the pandemic, if she saw me drinking, I stay up drinking whiskey with this dog. I sat in my recliner and I drank whiskey and I got angry.
Not that I don't believe him. I think it goes without saying that he probably was drunk for all of those stories. That said, it's as if Bert just wants to remind the audience that he is still a big drinker and party animal, but in a way that isn't sad and self-destructive.
No shirt, backpack full of beer. I'm wasted. I'm a good dad. Now.
Sometimes he'll just say what he was drinking, like his version of Get Her Done.
Double Jack on the rocks, lots of rocks.
Rarely does it actually add anything to the story, though. The end result of this is that Lucky is on the low end of what you'd expect from a Bert Kreischer special, if you're even remotely familiar with him. With the exception of the story about putting his dog down, there is very little that will surprise you. It's frat bro humor from a guy in his 50s. Some of the jokes are halfway decent. I know I laughed occasionally, which is more than I can say for some comedians, but even after 2 watches, I can't remember what I laughed at. Very little stuck with me positively. If anything, I actually liked his previous special, Razzle Dazzle, more. It had most of the same problems, but I think some of the bits were better and it got more funny as the special progressed. Whereas Lucky seems to tread water for most of its duration, which you could argue is a good metaphor for Bert's act in general. I know I've been kind of gloomy in my prognostications about comedy lately, but this one hit me, especially on the second watch through. I can come up with excuses and justifications for why a shitty comic like Joe Rogan can be successful. I can understand why Jeff Foxworthy still has a following, or why Jeff Dunham has a niche. I can even comprehend why Amy Schumer still gets work to a certain degree. Bert's success makes more sense when you stop looking at him like a normal comic and start viewing him as a gimmick act like Larry the Cable Guy. Only Bert's gimmick is being the you had to be there guy and telling jokes while shirtless. It's stupid, but somehow he's been able to spin it into one of the most successful comedy careers of all time. People cheer when he comes out on stage and throws his shirt off. It's ridiculous. The only explanation is that he appeals to the lowest common denominator. That, or he really is just lucky. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. And a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, who help make these videos possible. Thank you. Squirt, Rusty Shackelford, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Bone CK, Mango Saver, Devil Stick Disco, Mad Max Burger, Gaius Anisha Patton, Scott Richmond, Random Candor, Fuzzy Yanus, Jonas Namenson, Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, Julius Caesar Has Jungle Fever, Wet Cigarette, Firebrand, Quasi, Snepsts, Alex, and Neem.